Colour blending is something that a lot of beginner painters struggle with when they first start painting in watercolour. So in this video, I'll share some blending techniques and tips that should help you with your blending. Basically, blending paint is where you make a soft and gentle transition from one colour or one tonal variation to another. It's more difficult to achieve a soft blend in watercolour than it is in other mediums because watercolour paint dries so quickly and it's transparent. In this video, I want to show you a number of techniques that you can use to achieve a soft and gentle blend. And then I'll also use some of the techniques to paint some really simple lemons. Before I start, I want to mention that I now have over 125 full-length watercolour tutorials on my Patreon site. With all of the tutorials, I walk you step by step through my entire painting process. All of the videos are voiced over and they're in real time. I provide line drawings, reference photos, progress photos of my paintings, and copies of my finished paintings to my patrons. So if you want to improve your watercolour skills, please join us on Patreon. Okay, let's get back to blending paint now. One way to achieve a beautiful blend is to work wet on wet. Working wet on wet is my favourite technique and I use it all the time in my work. So for the first method of blending paint, I'll be working wet on wet. I've got a piece of Bar Hong cold press watercolour paper. I use this paper for my studies because it's cheaper than Arches paper. I've drawn some circles on it with a compass and I'm starting with this larger one. Generally, when I work on a large shape or section of my painting, I prefer to work on wet paper. Watercolour dries really fast, particularly in the summer here in Australia. So that's why I prefer to work on the wet paper a lot of the time. This is clean water that I'm painting on. I'm not going to take the water all the way out to the edge of the circle. I'll leave an edge of dry paper just in from my pencil line, and that will prevent the pigment from accumulating around the edges, creating a dark edge. I make sure that the paper is evenly covered with water as well. I don't want puddles lying above the surface of the paper. Here you can see the water on my paper. It's nice and glossy. It's evenly covered. There are no puddles sitting higher than the paper, and I've kept the water away from the external edge. When I pick up the paint, I drag it away from the puddle and I mix some water with it. And I roll my brush in the mixture, loading it fully, not just the tip of it. Sometimes I'll twirl my brush in the mixture to get the point back. And then I paint straight onto the wet paper. And I make sure I use a brush that is the right size for the shape that I'm painting. I don't use a tiny little brush for a shape this large. I keep reloading it when I need to. It's important not to fight with the paint. It should go on the paper easily. You shouldn't have to struggle to get it off your brush. So make sure your brush is fully loaded with paint. Every so often, I'll dip my brush back in my water container before I pick up the paint to make sure it's nice and wet. I do this without thinking about it. I know intuitively if my brush is too wet or not wet enough. The paper's still quite wet. Take my time and get those edges nice and round. Now because the paper's wet and the paint's wet, I might let it sit there a few minutes before I put the next colour on there, just to make sure it's not too wet. Okay, before that dries, I need to pick up my next colour. Again, I pull the colour away from the paint where it's squirted out and I mix some water with it. I roll my brush in it and I twirl it to get back my tip. I'll imagine that my light source is coming from the right, so I'll paint this darker colour on the left-hand side to create a shadow. The first layer of paint is still really quite wet. Because that first layer of paint is still wet, the two colours blend together with soft edges. I don't really have to do very much. Once I've got the paint where I want it, I can decide whether I like that edge where the two colours are joining. And if I don't particularly like the way the paint is sitting, I need to take the paint out of my brush now. To do that, I wash it quickly and I dab it on my cloth gently. I don't want all the moisture out of it because it will act like a sponge and it will take the paint off the paper. And I don't want to add any more water to the paper either. I need to make sure it's damp, not too wet, not too dry. And then I use it to gently push or tease the paint where I want it to sit. A lot of the time I don't have to do this. I'm quite happy with the paint the way it's sitting after I've painted it on. But sometimes I'll have a little play like this with my damp brush. That technique that I just showed you I use a lot, particularly when I'm painting on a large area. I prefer the paper to be wet because I can take my time. I'm not in a mad rush trying to get the paint on there before it dries. I'll show you an example of using that technique on my chicken painting. Here on the main body, I worked wet on wet. Wet paint on wet paper allowed me to get those beautiful colour blends on her tummy area. I've wet the body of the chicken with water, and here I'm using some gold ochre that I'm painting on top. While that gold ochre is still wet, I start painting on another colour. This is burnt sienna. Where the two colours meet, I get those lovely soft edges. So the colours blend together on their own. I don't really have to do very much other than place the paint on the paper. Then I needed a darker tone in the darkest areas. So I used some sepia then. You can see it's going straight over the top of the burnt sienna. The paper's still lovely and wet. All I have to do is put the paint where I want the colour to sit, and I let the water on the paper disperse the pigment. Once I've got it where I want it, I come back with a slightly damp brush and I have a little play if I think I need to. For that, I was on wet paper. For smaller areas, I might paint that first layer of paint on dry paper. And then when the first layer is wet, I'll come in with my next colour or tone. Now I'll paint in this second circle that I've got, but I'll do this one on dry paper. I wet my brush and then I load it up with the wet paint. I make sure it's nice and juicy and the brush is fully loaded. And I paint that straight onto the dry paper this time. If I think my brush isn't wet enough, I'll dip it back in the water and pick up a bit more paint. The paint needs to be nice and wet. As I said earlier, you don't want to fight with it. It should come off your brush easily. Keep reloading as you need more paint. Dip your brush in your water container if you think it feels a bit dry. Whenever I work on dry paper, I've got to work fairly quickly because I don't want the paint to dry before I get it on there. This time I don't wait. I go straight in with the darker colour. So the first layer of paint is still wet, and then I start to paint on this other colour. I try to make sure that the paint consistency is the same. I don't want to be adding any more water to the paper. Otherwise I'll start creating watercolour blooms. And for this one, I'm not going to fuss with that join there where the two colours merge. I'm happy with the way it's sitting, so I'll just let it dry by itself. There is one thing I could do though. I could make that colour darker. So it's still wet. I can add some more pigment there while it's wet. As long as I work fairly quickly, I can darken the pigment, add some more paint to my mixture so that it's not quite as light. Watercolour always dries lighter than what it appears when it's wet, so it's hard to judge how dark to put the paint colour on. But because my paper's still wet here, I can add some more paint. If it was starting to dry, I'd need to stop and I'd need to dry it off and then re-wet it with water. I'll show you how I do that in a little while. Here I'm just pushing the paint where I want it. I use that method if I'm painting a small area. For example, on this giraffe painting, I used that technique when I was painting most of the spots. Okay, here I'm painting some pale burnt sienna onto dry paper. When I say pale, I've got a bit of water mixed with it. Now, before that paint dries, I get another colour. This is sepia, and I drop that onto it where I want it to be slightly darker or a different colour. Spread it out with my brush. Because I'm working on top of the wet paint there, that gives me those soft blends of colour. With the third technique that I'll show you, I'll work on dry paper again, but this time I won't paint that first layer of paint all over the circle. I'll only paint it where I want that lighter colour to sit. With this third circle, again, I'll paint on dry paper like I said, but this time I won't completely cover the circle with this first layer of paint. I load the brush the same way, my paint consistency is the same. Just keep the paint where I want it to show on the painting. Okay, wash that colour out, pick up the next colour, nice and wet. And I paint that onto this side. I've got to work quickly because I don't want the paint to dry. These two colours have to meet, and when they meet, they need to be both wet. And that will give me that soft transition between the two colours. I can take that darker paint over the top of the first layer if I want to. And if I don't like the blend or the edge where the two colours touch one another, I can take the paint out of my brush, dab it on my cloth, make sure it's not too dry or too wet. Check it out first. It's just damp, and then I can play with that edge. The brush wetness is really important, so pay attention to it. The moisture in the brush needs to be the same as the moisture on the paper. It sounds difficult and technical, but when you're painting all the time, it becomes intuitive and you don't have to think about it after a while. If my brush has got too much water in it when I go back in to tease the paint where I want it, it will add that water to the paper and the paint will spread out again and I risk making a mess. If it's got no moisture in it, it will act like a dry sponge and it will suck some of the paint back off the paper, creating a lighter area where I don't want it. So be aware of that if you're tempted to go back in and have a play with your edge. Having said that, If you're just starting out with watercolour, it's probably best to leave it alone and accept what it gives you. Now for the fourth technique of blending. This next one might be helpful for beginner painters who don't have the confidence or the brush control needed to paint quickly. Okay, the fourth technique. Now, as I said, if you're a beginner, you might find this technique a little easier than the others. With this one, I'm just painting the permanent rose onto the dry paper. And I paint it all over the circle. When I did this one, I discovered a little patch on the paper where the paint wasn't sticking. Just there where my brush is now. You can see how the paint is not going on there. There might be a sizing problem with the paper. I do like this paper, but it's not as good as my Arches paper. So that's why I use this paper for studies rather than my main paintings. Here I'm trying to fuss with it. Okay, now I'm going to leave that to dry now. It's got to dry completely. I ended up drying it with the hairdryer. What I'm going to do now is wet it with water. This time I take the water all the way to the edge of the circle. The reason I do that is because if I don't, I risk leaving water lines behind. Some people refer to them as tide lines, where you can see the water has dried and it's left a mark. So I take the water right to the edge to prevent that from happening. I don't need to take it right over to the left-hand edge because that's where I'll be putting the paint. Now I pick up my darker colour. I've got water on the brush and I load it fully. And then I paint that onto the wet paper where I want it. So use this technique if you're not real fast at painting and you need a bit more time. You can always get that first layer on, dry it completely, re-wet it with water, and then put your next layer on. Okay, now if you don't like the way the paint is merging, take the paint out of your brush, dab off the excess water, make sure that it's not too wet or too dry, and then use it to tease the paint where you want it, to soften the edge a bit more. You may not have to do that. You might find that you're happy with the way that it's sitting. Okay, so as I mentioned, that technique might be helpful to you if you paint slower than I do and you find that your paint dries too quickly before you can get those other tonal variations on there. This next technique I use is the most difficult and requires the most practice. This is one to learn though because it's really important and you will use it often through your paintings. This technique is where you soften the paint edge manually with your brush before the paint dries. I've made another video about softening edges where I show you how to do it correctly and a few things that can go wrong. So check that video out as well as this one. With this technique, I'll do the same thing that I did on the circle next to this one. I'll paint a layer of the lighter colour on first on dry paper, all over the circle. And then I need to dry that completely. Okay, that's completely dry now. I've got my darker pigment. I paint that onto the dry paper as well. So I haven't wet it with water this time. I've just dried it off and now I'm painting this second colour on dry paper. Okay, I get it where I think I need it, and then I need to get the paint out of my brush really quickly. Dab my brush in my water container, take off the excess moisture. I make sure it's not too wet, not too dry, and then I use it to rub over my edge. So the paper's dry, remember? I soften the paint edge with the damp brush. Every now and then I might have to go back into my water to clean the paint off that's on it and then dab it on the cloth again. I have to do this fairly quickly because the paint will dry before I'm able to soften it if I don't. So that's a technique to practice over and over and over again until you understand it. And check out the other video that I've made, because I show you what can go wrong if you don't make sure that your brush is the correct wetness. Practice that one, it's important and you will use it often. Now I want to paint a really simple lemon for you so that I can show you the different techniques on an actual painting rather than just in a circle. I'll paint 2 lemons showing some of the different techniques. I cleaned my water container out. I've got some fresh water here and I'm painting the water onto the lemon. The same as I painted the circle, I don't need to take the water all the way out to the edge where my pencil line is. I can leave a little dry gap around the edge. It doesn't matter with this first layer, and that will keep the paint from accumulating around the edge, creating a darker edge where I don't want it. Okay, that's covered with water. This colour here is Windsor Lemon. I've got water on my brush, I drag the paint away and I load it completely with the paint. And I'll paint it on to the wet paper. And I'm going to paint this all over the lemon like I did for that very first circle, the large circle that I painted at the start. This gives me nice even coverage and I can take my time. I don't have to rush because I'm not worried about the paint drying. Okay, that's completely covered with a layer of Windsor Lemon. This second yellow here is transparent yellow. It's a different colour to Windsor Lemon. It's still a cool yellow, but it's a little bit darker. It's slightly different. While that Windsor Lemon is wet, I paint on this other colour. I'll leave the lighter colour showing in the lightest section of the lemon. So that first layer of paint will remain showing on the lightest areas of the lemon. I need to paint a darker colour on top of that on the left side where it's quite a bit darker on my reference photo. If my paper was starting to dry, I would need to wait until it was completely dry, and then I would re-wet the entire lemon with water, the way you saw me do that on circle 4, and then I could put the third colour on there. If the paper and the paint is still nice and wet and has a good sheen on the surface, then I'm right to paint on my third colour. Looking at my paper more closely, you can see that it has a good sheen on the surface. Everything looks nice and juicy. So I'm right to go in and paint the darkest colour on now. For the darkest colour, I thought I'd use a complementary colour and darken the yellow with it. So that's Windsor Violet, and I'll mix some of the transparent yellow with it. I still want it to be yellow, but I want it to be darker. Because it's wet, I can continue on. So I dab that onto the darker sections that I see. And as I paint, I have to be mindful that my paint that I'm putting on is not too wet. It needs to be similar wetness to the paint that's on the paper. If the paint mixture is too runny, it will spread too far and make a mess and disturb the pigment. The same with my brush. If my brush is too wet, I risk putting more water on the paper, and I don't want to do that. So always be mindful of the amount of water that you've got in your paint and the amount of water that you've got on the brush. And try to correct it if something's wrong. now I've taken the paint out of my brush. So to do that, I dip it in my water container and I dab it on my cloth. I make sure it's not too wet or too dry, and then I can move the paint around that's on the paper. I've just picked up a bit more paint here, the darker colour, and I'll paint that on while it's wet. And then again, I can take the paint out of my brush and move that paint where I want it. Okay, my lemon is dry now, and I look at it and I think that I could probably darken the darkest areas. To me, they don't look quite dark enough. So to do that, I re-wet the lemon with water. I want the paint edges to be soft where the darker colour is. This time when I wet the lemon, I have to make sure I wet the entire lemon and take the water all the way to the edge. Otherwise, I'll get those water lines that I talked about earlier. So I'm careful to take the water to the edge. Sometimes when the water dries, it leaves those marks behind. Even though I won't be painting all over the lemon, I'll only be painting in the darker sections, I still need to put that water all over it. I'll get my darker colour again. I might make it a tiny bit darker this time. Transparent yellow and Windsor violet. And I'll dab that onto the darker areas, just to increase the colour in the shadow area. I've just picked up a bit more paint. I think that's close to what I want. That has dried now, and I'm re-wetting this little back section with some water. And here I've got that darker colour, just painting in that shadow that I can see there. Okay, now I'll mix colour for the shadow, the cast shadow. So that's a bit of violet, but I think that's too much, so I'll put a bit more of the yellow in there. And I'll paint the cast shadow on dry paper. The lemon is completely dry, of course. And here I've dipped my dirty brush into a bit more of the Windsor violet that I'm dropping on there while that shadow's wet. Okay, moving on to this second lemon. This time it's a bit smaller, the lemon itself is smaller, and I'm painting Windsor lemon onto the dry paper. I'll paint this one like I painted Circle 3, where I put the one colour or the lighter colour on first on the right hand side, and then I put the darker colour on the left hand side. And where the two colours meet, they merge together softly because the paint is wet. Now I'll pick up the transparent yellow. And I'll paint that on this side. I've got to work fairly quickly because my paper's dry. I don't have the luxury of time as I did with the first one. Push that darker yellow into the lighter one, and where they meet, the paint just blends together softly by itself. Then I get a bit more paint and I push it further around. If my paper is wet enough, I can keep going with the darker colour. If it was starting to dry, I'd need to wait until it was completely dry and then I would re-wet it with water. Mine's wet enough so I can keep going. And then I take notice of my brush. If I think it's too wet, I just dab it on the side. And then I can start painting on the darkest areas. Okay, I take the paint out of my brush again and make sure it's not too wet, not too dry. I can fiddle with the paint a little. Spread it out, move it where I want it. I'll put a bit of that darker colour over here while it's wet. And because I can see I've still got time, I picked up a bit more of the transparent yellow on its own. I decided it needed a bit more. If it was beginning to dry, I wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, I dried that with my hairdryer. It's completely dry. And now very gently, I come back over the top with some clean water. I have to be very careful that I don't disturb the pigment. So I'm very softly painting that water on. I want to deepen the shadow area. Again, I don't think I had it dark enough. So that's a little bit of water on the dry paper. And then I paint on that mixture of violet and yellow again. It's always best to try and get it done the first time so you don't have to come back a second time. But sometimes these things can't be helped. Now, I've got to pay attention to my edges here. I can see some nasty edges, so I've just taken the paint out of my brush again, and I can fiddle with these edges to tidy them up. It's always a good idea to keep an eye on your painting as it dries. And over here I've got a bit more of that darker colour. The paper's wet here too. Okay, now it's completely dry and I'm painting on the cast shadow again with the mixture of the violet and transparent yellow. And that's on dry paper there. And this time I'll drop in some of the yellow mixture while that violet mixture's wet, just for interest. Makes the shadow look a bit more interesting. This little brush is called an Eradicator brush. It's made by Rosemary Co in the UK. I'm going to use it to remove some highlights and soften some edges. I'm going to use the brush wet and the paper will be dry. This little edge here on the back of the lemon I'm not particularly happy with. So I use the brush wet and I rub over the paint very gently so that I don't disturb the paper or take too much paint off. I've put a link to this little brush in the description of this video. And then I also thought that I'd take a bit of paint off just in the centre of the lemon to create a highlight there. So the brush is wet, the paper's dry, and then I use the paper towel to dab at the pigment. I'll do the same thing on this one. A little rub gently, and then the paper towel. There you go, there's some blending exercises that you can try yourself, and then try putting some of the techniques into practice by painting some simple lemons. Make sure you practice over and over until you have some success. It's those little daily habits of practicing that will pay off in the long run. It's not easy, but if you put the hours in and persist with it, you will be rewarded because watercolour is such a beautiful and exciting medium to use. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel so that I can keep making these videos for you. I'll see you soon. So in this video, I'll share some blending techniques and tips that you should do to help you with blending. And then I'll also use some of the techniques to paint some really simple lemons. I use that method if I'm painting a small area. For example, on this giraffe painting, if my brush has got too much water in it when I go back in to tease the paint, it will if my brush has got too much water in it when I go back in to tease the paint where I want it, it will add water to the paper and the paper will spread out again. No, the paper's not going to spread out again, the paint will spread out again. Paint will spread, not paper. If it's got no moisture in it and it's completely dry, it will act, that's what no moisture means. No moisture means completely dry. Practice that one, it's important to learn, and you'll lose it, you'll lose it if you don't practice it. You'll use it often, you won't lose it often, you'll use it often. Practice that one, it's important and you will use it often. Now I want to paint a really simple lemon for you. Oh, my nose is itchy. Sorry, I just need to scratch it. Just on the side, here.